It's great to be here. It's a wonderful couple of panels. We had a lot to work with and a lot to build upon. I think one of the great things about going last in a conference is that we understand exactly what needs to be done to be the best panel of the day. So we're going to do our best to make that happen. We have a great crew here up on this side of the table with Rachel, Raad, and my colleague Tim. Longer bios are online, so I won't waste any more of our time getting into that. Look, I think if you'll permit me to take us back to what feels like ages ago, all the way back to mid-May of 2025, Trump visited the region and spent a number of days in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, and the UAE, drumming up a lot of interest in the U.S. Middle East economic corridor with a heavy emphasis on Gulf states. And of course, there was a very clear energy dimension to these ties, and I think there still is. Now, at the moment, everyone is focused for good reason on the Israel-Iran conflict, and of course, there's also a very obvious energy dimension to this conflict, which, I wrote in my notes earlier, it's unfolding conflict. Maybe it's a done conflict for now. We'll see when we leave this room. But if we zoom back out and think about the longer term of U.S. Gulf relations, the energy dimension of these ties are definitely going to come back into focus. There are overlapping energy interests between the U.S. and Gulf states. We'll talk a little bit about that today. This is also a domain where I think it's safe to say there are going to be frictions. I mean, I think the energy space is a source of friction in U.S. Gulf relations as well. Gulf investors have announced over the past few months major investments in the U.S. energy sector. We heard a little bit about that in the last panel, especially in the LNG space. ADNOC, XRG announcements in particular. Some of these announcements coming, by the way, just a couple of days ago. We know American oil and gas firms have been operating in the region for quite some time, and that will continue in the future. But I think more importantly for U.S. Gulf economic ties is the degree to which the region's energy sector and energy dynamics continue to help governments in the Gulf ensure that their economies are attractive investment destinations for the foreseeable future. But I don't think anyone here, at least myself, believes that the U.S. energy interests of our partners and allies in the Gulf are necessarily and always at the top of mind for President Trump. So I think this is to get us back to the potential for friction that I mentioned earlier. So with that, I want to turn this conversation over to our panelists and start with Raad, if you will. Can you give us your view of the major developments in the U.S. energy sector and also energy policies and policy decisions coming out of this White House, the second Trump administration, that you believe are most consequential for relations between the U.S. and Gulf states?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Ambassador. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I have to say, actually, it's rather intimidating after the last few panels because you actually have to live up to their standards. But hey-ho. Look, what are the most consequential? I mean, I think if you look at energy and you look at, as you mentioned, Gulf-U.S. relations sort of broadly, it's not just in the energy space. It's the second and third order consequences that may matter as much going through them. I think, possibly the most consequential thing about this administration is it has no joined-up thinking. And it's hard to try and have alignment and hard to try and sort of take full advantage of a circumstance if there's no joined-up thinking on energy, foreign policy, or anything else. There's certainly overlap, but how the administration sees that overlap and how the Gulf states see that overlap is, open to question whether, the degree to which that is the same perception. You can argue that the Gulf states played a blinder when Trump went to the region. but they did it by essentially responding to his desire to show large figures of investment and to have his feathers stroked. That doesn't necessarily make for a strategy. And similarly, as you mentioned about Trump, there's a big question about whether he really cares, as long as he gets the money and he gets the stature. I mean, this is an administration dedicated to an America first set of policies, and there's no sort of evidence to suggest so far that it's going to divert from that, and quite the contrary. So I think if you start to look then at some of, within that context of what I've said, some of the sort of areas and some of the specific policies, you can see some of that tension, and you can see some of the, well, it might be good, it might be bad, but perhaps over time we're just going to have to play the short game and work our way through it. I mean, the biggest one is energy dominance. And energy dominance, in some ways, the drill baby drill, which was on a tweet. Are they called tweets on Truth Social, or are they called Trumps? But anyway, there was a tweet that came out that sort of said, drill baby drill, we want higher output now. Well, that shows a slight lack of understanding of how the oil and gas patch works. But, again, it's something that is a direct challenge, particular time of when markets are well supplied, to the Gulf states. So there certainly isn't alignment there. And, the Gulf states are still cognizant as to what happened after 2015. And I think as, they still have that in the back of their mind. Now, their policies, and certainly OPEC's policies of late, may not suggest that, but I think it's something that they're watching. You get into a little bit of the rhetoric versus reality issue, but there's no doubt that drill baby drill here, if that happened, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why it may not, fiscal discipline, the nature of the plays, etc. But if that happened, it would be a challenge to the Gulf, both in terms of market share and in terms of price. So that's one aspect. I think another aspect where you seemingly have overlap, but again, whether it's alignment is another matter, is on climate issues. This administration has been very clear in terms of eschewing concerns about climate change and moving and focusing very heavily on fossil fuels. I think I think some of the discussion or some of the rhetoric around the importance of energy policy, the importance of energy poverty and addressing energy poverty and policies around, promoting fossil fuels, that all aligns, or that sort of, again, is an overlap with the Gulf states. But for the Gulf states, renewables and new energy are important. They're seen as important source of investment. They're seen as important ways of developing the local economy. And they're seen as ways of dealing with local demand. And we mentioned earlier that, the Gulf states were looking to invest in the renewables sector in the United States as well. So those policies start to have friction. I think possibly one of the biggest areas of friction that isn't really sort of acknowledged may come on issues to do with clean barrels and the carbon footprint of barrels. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia in particular, sort of started this. The UAE has pursued it more recently. The notion of having the lowest carbon footprint barrel. The Saudis are tremendously proud that, a nature study, which in part they helped fund, but a nature study found that Saudi barrels were the cleanest after Denmark in terms of Scope 1 emissions. And that, for them, I think, is a competitive advantage as they look to energy transitions, a way to say that as carbon, as emissions become more important, you may start to have premiums and discounts on barrels on the basis of market perception to that. We're not there yet, but that's a gamble for 25 years' time, for 2050. And for them, the US stepping back from that, I think, goes against it. And then finally, you just have what we're seeing in terms of politics. And again, overlap, yes, but alignment, absolutely not. So the oil market risk that you're seeing at the moment certainly isn't something that the Gulf states, and particularly the big Gulf producers, would want to see. I mean, traders love volatility. That's how you make money. Producers don't. They want the reliability that Paul talked about earlier. So when you have a president who, you know, on one day is saying we have to remove the Supreme, or we should think about regime change in Iran, and today is announcing Iran can now sell oil to China, you know, apparently Trump has approved it. You start to get some of that disconnect. And I think the other area where you're going to see that is tariffs, where you have an up and down on tariffs, uncertainty on tariffs. I mean, that hits supply and that hits demand. And at a time when the Gulf states are trying to manage a delicate market and one that has a lot of downside risk for them in terms of price, it's hard to see how US policy is benefit. So it's a mixed bag. But as it goes back to this, I think two things: lack of joined up thinking and America first being the dominant thought, which makes alliance of any sort much, much more difficult.
Great. We're going to get back to tariffs in just a minute with Rachel. But before we do, I want to go over to Tim. I mean, Tim, what's at stake for Gulf states here, especially Saudi Arabia? I mean, when you look at the U.S. Energy sector and policies, related policies, where are you seeing the impact on the economies of the Saudi economy and also government finances? And you know, you've been looking at the Saudi economy for quite some time. Can you give us a sense of the kind of historical dynamics at play, and to what degree what you're seeing now may mark a departure from kind of historical trends, potentially a new era, reason to reconsider and reassess what's going on here? Over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Rob. So, I mean, I guess I come at this from a very macro point of view, and I guess at that level I see, you know, US and Saudi as being competitors in the global oil market. And, you know, I think, you know, if I look back to, you know, the period in, 2014-16, you know, the price drop and how OPEC and then OPEC Plus reacted was very much, you know, response to what was happening in US output. Again, you know, recently, not just the US, but other non-OPEC Plus producers with supply going up, has created, the dilemma that OPEC Plus and Saudi have had recently. So I think while in, other areas, it may be not as, overtly competitive, at least from my view in the crude sphere, it is basically a competitive relationship. What does that mean for for Saudi? I think in some senses, we're clearly not in a 2014-16 situation, but some of the pressures are not dissimilar to that period in terms of, you have government spending having gone up quite sharply the last 3 years. You now have the, additional financing need of the PIF and more broadly around Vision 2030. So, while, it's undoubtedly true there have been huge reforms in the Saudi economy over the last decade, I'm not fully convinced that the sort of pro-cyclicality of Saudi policy has changed now relative to 10 years ago. I mean, it's certainly probably diminished in the sense we've seen, less of an expenditure increase in response to high oil prices this time than we saw before, less budget overruns in terms of expenditure, but still quite significant budget overruns. And we're now in a situation where, going back to the 2014-16 example, the central government itself had, minimal debt, large deposits at the central bank. If you take the net of those, it was about positive 50% of GDP. If you now take it, it's probably negative 20% of GDP. This is just at the central government level. So that's a huge change. It doesn't mean that Saudi is, short of financial assets, far from it. But I do think that there's less financial flexibility now, given the investments and the commitments that have been made, than there has been earlier. On the plus side, I think the policy-making framework is much stronger now than it was previously, so they're probably in a better position where they can make decisions that they need to make. So I guess, in a sense, it goes back to the point I made in the panel this morning. I think if you look across the GCC, clearly UAE, Qatar, I think Kuwait as well, still are, clearly running, I think fiscal and external surpluses. Saudi this year is going to be running both a fiscal and an external deficit. So the amount of money that is going to be, there's going to be no new money to put out there, either internationally, or is going to be tight in terms of the domestic financing, unless what they'll have to do is they'll either have to borrow or they'll have to liquidate existing assets and reallocate those. And I think this is coming at a time where the commitments that Saudi has made, both within Vision 2030, to Trump on the trip, outside of Vision 2030 in terms of the World Cup, the Expo, Asian Winter Games, and then potentially commitments that will be needed in the region in terms of rebuilding are huge. So I guess I have while it's not a, in a sense, a doomsday scenario, it's probably, from a financing point of view, a less optimistic view than the feeling that there's still a whole load of money and cash that's floating around ready to be invested at the moment. So I'll stop there.
Before you stop, can you just give us a quick, sense of today how much of Saudi government revenues are still dependent upon the oil and gas sector?
Yeah. So last year, if you look at the split in the central government revenue, about 60% was oil, 40% non-oil. But I think the question with the non-oil, of course, a lot of the non-oil revenue is from the value-added tax, which is linked to, private consumption has grown pretty strongly the last few years. So if there is a cutback in government spending, which I have to say at this stage, I think what the finance minister has suggested is there's not going to be a cutback and they'll just run a bigger deficit. But if there is a cutback, then does that begin to affect the value-added tax intake? So I think the real question is how independent is the non-oil revenue and indeed the non-oil economy from the oil price and oil revenue cycle?
Okay. Thanks, Tim. Look, that was really helpful for laying out some of the domestic dynamics that are at play within Saudi Arabia and how, they are directly linked to global energy dynamics. You also brought in some kind of historical perspective from 2014, 15, 16. It crossed my mind that during that period we didn't have tariffs. We didn't have the trade wars like we've seen. And before this last Israel-Iran war, the last war we were thinking about, which recent memory, was the trade war with China, really, was the big one that was on people's mind. So over to you, Rachel. We've got trade war that maybe has come to an uneasy truce, talk about some kind of trade deals, but also the deadline for the suspension of tariffs is also coming up in early July, if I'm not mistaken. So there's also, beyond the domestic picture, domestic finances, kind of importance of the oil and gas sector to government revenues and kind of oil and non-oil economies, there's also a macroeconomic picture here too, which is really important. So how does the U.S. administration's trade policy, tariffs and other instruments and measures, affect the energy markets and the energy interests of Gulf states? And also if you could give us a sense of what views you're hearing from the region about what regional officials and investors are saying and thinking about some of the policies and the decisions coming here out of Washington on that front.
Yeah, I'll do my best. Lots of good questions there. Yeah, and I'm conscious of the fact that looking back, it wasn't until later in Trump's first term that you had the significant, I mean, they don't seem significant compared to the current tariffs, but the size, but relevant to the energy industry, you had U.S.-China trade war at that point, and it took a long time for U.S. exports of energy to China to recover. So I think we can sort of come back to that at a later point, also relevant with the sort of tweet or post or Trump from this morning about Iran. So yeah, I think from the view from the region, I think, what I was hearing even, in sort of in the transition period was, in the Gulf, we don't have to worry about tariffs. We don't trade that much with the U.S. We're willing to invest. This is something not a big deal. And I think some of the rhetoric around the president's visit a couple months ago kind of maybe bore that out, but the indirect effects are very significant. I think the previous panel went into that, and Raad, I think, highlighted that as well. We have both this element that on the one hand, tariffs are increasing the cost of production in the United States, especially the steel and aluminum tariffs. It's a little bit of a mixed story because demand has fallen so much that things like steel pipe have actually not increased as much as you would expect, but there is really a price uncertainty of the cost structure in the United States. So to Raad's point about the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, the U.S. and the Gulf on oil, our competitors, maybe there's some that say, well, maybe there's a little more market share, but the demand picture, this uncertainty about global growth, I think is the biggest one, and that ties into Tim's points about availability of fiscal resources. Looking back to the president's trip from, a couple months ago now, there were two important policies that were introduced there that had almost nothing to do with tariffs, but are really important to GCC-U.S. relationship. Number one was something called the AI diffusion rule, which makes it easier theoretically for countries in the Gulf to import high-level chips. And the other one was an announcement of an expedited process for investors to be pre-approved via the CFIUS national security screening process. And both were policies when I was in the UAE in December have been real, and before that, real sources of concern, pain, and not just in the UAE, across the region. And both, I think, are some things that the administration has made progress on, but there's a lot of implementation details that haven't happened yet. The AI diffusion rule of the Biden administration that, was pulled at the last minute, but it's not clear that there's chips flowing yet. And I come back to that partly because if the Gulf is thinking in this area of alignment, well, there are goods that we'd like to buy from the U.S. There's been a willingness to say, well, we're willing to, and this is particularly the UAE and Saudi Arabia, we're willing to strip out Chinese infrastructure and use U.S. security-approved infrastructure for AI. There's still some implementation questions there. And I come back to AI, even though I'm diverting a little bit directly from energy, because in this global context of AI and data centers driving power demand, I think it's a very important one. On the CFIUS piece, the national security screening, I think that's also relevant for some of the investments that we were talking about in the last panel. Some agreements, offtake agreements, wouldn't really require a national security screening, but some of the investments we're talking about would. So that's something to watch. The other thing I'm hearing and seeing out of the region is this continued interest, it's part of a global trend, of signing other trade agreements. We've seen the UAE go out and do dozens of these CEPA agreements. This predates this Trump administration, but these are trade and investment partnerships. They started out with countries where there was a lot of government-to-government links, but they've extended beyond that. India has been a kind of key country where you can really point to results. But we're also seeing at the GCC level attempts to sign agreements with the Europeans, with the Brits. I mean, we'll see where that goes. I think one of the previous panel, Kate, you referenced CBAM. There's various issues out there. On the GCC specifically with trade agreements, it's notable that none of the countries are on this, as far as I'm aware, this top priority list of countries that the U.S. is trying frantically to get a concept of a deal together with. That's partly because bilateral trade right now is pretty small. These countries almost exclusively, buy more from the U.S. than they sell to the U.S. And these were all the GCC countries were pretty much all ones that got the 10% reciprocal tariff, the lowest level you could get. So it's not a key part of the agenda, but these other tools of economic statecraft, I would say, are more so. And then this question mark also of what capacity is there to partner with the U.S., both in investments at home, but also abroad. I referenced really briefly in my question critical minerals, but it is one very much on the minds, particularly because, as you say, Robert, there was some kind of a truce, announced in London a couple weeks ago between the U.S. and China. Central to that agreement was trade in rare earth magnets. So far, there doesn't seem like that flow is coming yet. The U.S. and China both have been using export controls as a form of leverage. I think there's been a lot of interest from both the last administration and the current U.S. administration to perhaps work with Gulf countries globally on critical mineral development. There's probably been more hope than action there. Within the GCC, though, I think there's different approaches there. For Saudi Arabia, mining and critical minerals, it's an area of desired tech transfer, but it's also about domestic economic development and whether there could be mining and processing at home. For the UAE, it seems more about regional investments, and Qatar is in the mix a little bit there as well. But I think there's still this question mark about who's doing the processing and what asks the U.S. might have about the Chinese role in key supply chains. So I think, this is a moving picture, but I think the question mark, especially on the tariff side, does come back to the ability to actually deliver on predictable investment environment in the U.S. to attract this inward investment. And then there's the point that Tim was just making about the sending capital. But the tariffs, I think really, and the uncertainty around the tariffs, I think have been something that makes it difficult in the region and elsewhere to predict what demand is going to be.
I'm glad you brought up investment dynamics and also the attractiveness of the U.S. as an investment destination. I mean, this maybe will bring us back to Raad. You mentioned rhetoric versus reality. I mean, how do you distinguish the rhetoric versus the reality of some of the announcements we've heard? Gulf investments in U.S. energy, in LNG. I mean, some of this there are existing investments, but we've heard over the past couple of months, even in the past couple of days, pretty massive investment pledges being thrown around, long-term investment pledges. It seems to me that a lot of these, announcements are predicated upon, a big bet on AI infrastructure and the power needed to generate a lot of the infrastructure, data centers, and the like. How are you viewing these announcements? And back to the original question. I mean, can you help us separate a little fact from fiction, if that's possible?
I can do it I can probably do it at a level of 100,000 feet,
okay.
which is not bad at this moment in time, given the administration. Look, I think the separating between the two. There is undoubtedly an interest by the Gulf states to invest in the United States in key sectors. Mm-hmm. That has been there. That predates the Trump administration. Mm-hmm. It may be given added impetus, given judgment in terms of how to at least ensure that the Trump administration isn't going to turn against you. But there's also a great deal of self-interest there. I mean, I think some of the investments, certainly on the gas sector, make perfect sense. This is a sector that's going to expand. For countries like the UAE, there's a limited upside in terms of what they can do domestically. Why not take your capital and deploy it in somewhere where there is a chance of growth, where certainly you anticipate that the market is going to be there, and moving forwards, use that as an additional revenue stream. I think for the UAE in particular, and that also is some of the thinking around some of the oil deals that's done, is, if we have to cap our own production at home, why don't we also have revenue streams for production elsewhere that isn't going to be sort of judged under OPEC? But in the longer term, even more than that, then you have this basket of production that you keep moving forwards that you can then manage against what may be declines in demand. Again, and that's over a 25-year period, which is how long these deals run, if not longer. So I think there is a reality about wanting to do that. I think where the rhetoric comes in is the numbers. I mean, it seems sort of pretty simple to say, if you can get anywhere near $1 trillion, Trump loves you. If you can get to 600 billion, you'll get a nice hug. Once you start getting lower than that, then you're in sort of the same sort of band as a lot of other players, and woe betide you if you're only doing millions. And I think that's partly what we're seeing. I mean, I think, there's a great deal of creative accounting. I mean, going back to, my favorite example of this is, how two deals with, in Kurdistan recently by US companies could have been valued at $110 billion. I mean, I can see creative ways of doing it, but that isn't the value of the investment. So I think what you've got is number inflation, and it is the notion that you have to play to the sensibilities of a rather mercurial president who's shown that he's quite happy to sort of turn policy around on its head if it suits him or if he, depending on his mood. So I think that's where you're getting some of the rhetoric. And in terms of, I think also how much is actually committed versus what is a headline number. How much of this is aspirational? And I think the difference between aspirational and what you actually see invested is going to depend on how US policy evolves, how the relationship evolves, how the economy evolves, and some of the fiscal challenges and the financial challenges that the Gulf countries face. But right now, it doesn't kill you to say, I'm going to invest $1 trillion. I mean, Trump isn't going to be around to sort of work out whether that happens. Mm-hmm. So you've got the benefit of it.
Tim, how about in the other direction? I mean, if we think about Saudi Arabia, a country which is advancing a very ambitious, very expensive economic transformation plan with a big, at least stated emphasis on economic diversification away from oil. And at the same time, this is ongoing, and as this is ongoing, we know that it's going to depend on the continued ability of the government to generate healthy proceeds from exporting energy commodities. With that in mind, where would you rank, or how would you assign kind of a hierarchy of needs from a Saudi perspective? I mean, from policymakers in Riyadh, in terms of the type of engagement they want to see with U.S. companies, with U.S. investors. I mean, you've got the energy dimension. We talked a little bit about overlap versus alignment. But I mean, there's a much broader economic space that I think the Saudis are trying to tap into, and I don't necessarily think that it's in the energy space when they're thinking about what they want to get, what they would like to get out of U.S. companies, investors. So could you give us a little more light, shed a little more light on that?
I mean, I think the answer is where would they like to see investment? I mean, everywhere, right? Everywhere that helps with the diversification agenda. But I mean, clearly, I guess, AI, broader tech, tourism, entertainment, mining, defense, I think these are areas where, they are looking to develop, clearly domestic industries. I guess in a sense we're talking inward FDI, investment from Saudi into the US, and I guess the two, in a sense, are part of the same deal often, right? In that you go and invest in a US company with the hope that it will come, or the understanding it'll come and set up within Saudi. So, I mean, I guess Lucid is, one very obvious example of that, but there are others as well. So I think that will continue. They will look to promote that. Clearly, tourism is one area, I think, under the diversification agenda that's done really well. You look at the data; it's pretty impressive growth. Others less clear. Mining, there's clearly been a lot of focus on the sector. It's hard to see very much in the export data and the production data as yet, but I guess that's probably a longer time horizon, to see that. But again, I think the question goes more broadly is, with less resources, financial resources, and a lot of commitments, how do you begin to rebalance this? And I think from a economic point of view, clearly things that directly benefit your local citizens are going to be high priority. And I think, though, a lot of the stuff being done in the housing sector, for example, is probably relatively untouchable, I would think, in this environment. Things that are going to generate employment, is another area. But then you also then have, high-profile things that will be very embarrassing if they don't come off. So, you can make arguments right across the board for how you prioritise, these projects. Some are very close to the heart of the Crown Prince. They're going to be hard. So, you can almost go through the whole, sort of investment agenda and make arguments why, parts are untouchable. So I think it's a very difficult question to answer, where if finances stay around current levels, where do you pull back? And I guess where you probably come out is it's going to be a bit of everything, I suspect.
Good. I think at this point we've got about 20 minutes left before the official hard stop of our panel. So I will open up for questions, and as and when they emerge, just either stick up your hand or put your name tag up. And in the meantime, I have a number of other questions I'm going to bug my panelists with. But are there any questions right now that anyone would like to jump in with? I see Mimi over there.
Hi, yeah, thanks for taking my question. I just have a question for Rachel on tariffs. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the aluminum, steel tariffs, the 232 that the U.S. is looking at right now. It doesn't look like there's any changes in 232, but I know countries like Bahrain, who have a big presence in the aluminum industry, are very eager to hear. Mm-hmm. So what's your idea on that?
And Rachel, if you don't mind, I saw one other hand, so let's just take two at a time, and then we'll bite that off first. Okay. Sure.
Well, I was hoping you talk about currency and gold and what the oil is, what the dynamics are as far as, are they denominated in dollars? Is that going to continue? Or how much is there a shift to other denominations? And so how is that impacting the oil market?
Okay.
Do you want me to take
Sure.
2 through 2? Yeah, Mimi, I think really good question. So I think there is a really strong political commitment to protecting the U.S. steel and aluminum market, even if that undermines other manufacturing goals, right? I think we can look at, this has been one of the most protected industries over many, many, many presidents. I think we see the most insight from the U.S.-UK trade deal. That's maybe the most developed and public one we've seen. And then in that agreement, there is, I think the U.S. is moving towards a sort of almost quota system of a certain volume of certain types of steel products could come in either tariff-free or at a lower tariff level. But there's a lot of details that aren't there yet. I know that there's been talk about doing that with Mexico and some of the USMCA countries. countries. You could see sort of Bahrain or even the Emirates trying to sort of come in that way. One, it's not directly related to aluminum, but I know that one of the deals I was watching that was sort of signed or, put in the fore during the president's visit was one with one of the Emirates aluminum companies, this idea of using the byproducts of gallium from the aluminum processing perspective. So there might be some, again, not a lot of details there, questions about the economic viability. So there might be some ability to trade. But, what I'm hearing out of the administration is, if anything, they're going to be adding products that include steel to that list. And we've also seen, I think, the government put more protection on with the Nippon Steel, U.S. Steel acquisition, the government sort of willingness to use what has been called a golden share. This is definitely a highly protected market. So I think countries like Bahrain would probably need to make the case of why there were sort of strong U.S. interests for some sort of an export, some sort of a waiver. But this element of quotas, and the like, I think would be where to watch. There are also, what I didn't mention earlier, but I think is relevant on the tariff side, is that the reprieve between the eye-poppingly high tariffs on China did reduce the chance that countries in the Gulf and elsewhere would be places that would be used for tariff hopping, right, and repackaging of materials. Now, Southeast Asia in general would have been better positioned for that. They were part of a China plus one strategy, but I know there was a lot of chatter right after Liberation Day about whether there were 10% tariff locations that could be used as transshipment ports and the like. All of these policies mean a lot more regulation and proof about rules of origin and arguments about U.S. content. It's all become a lot more complicated, which is why I'm glad I spent much of the last 10 years looking at sanctions and export controls. Anyway, I digress. But so that's what I think is happening on 232 on steel. But then there's also pharma. There's a lot of other ones coming through the mix, but I think for the Gulf, the steel and aluminum one is probably most important. The pharma will be very important for Europe, I would say. I think others may have things to say about currency. My sense is that there hasn't really been a big move away from the dollar. Gulf sovereign funds, some are more exposed to the dollar, some diversified a little bit more, but it's hard. The U.S. market, despite challenges, and I think is still the biggest, most liquid capital market. And so it might make sense to add a little bit more gold to portfolios in a region where gold is an asset people like. But I just don't see a lot of evidence that there's a tipping point. But Raad and Tim may have other things about.
I wasn't sure whether the question was broadly on diversification away from the dollar or whether it was on oil trade and the dollar. Because I think in the oil trade, right, there have been cases of, non-dollar settlement. Not, any significant portion. In my view, it's very unlikely you're going to see much of a move away from the dollar as, the oil settlement. But
my sense was with the sanctions imposed, before that, Russia and the BRICS were trying to move away. And so now, was that happening under Biden, or is it happening less under Trump? Because there certainly is a de-dollarization, but the goal is, oil is very critical as far as maintaining the dollar as a reserve currency.
so, I think there have been settlements, right, particularly with China, where it has not been in dollars. But I don't think that that's a particularly significant part of the overall market. And to be honest, I think the talk of moving away from the dollar more generally has been around years, right? And if you look at IMF data, particularly on where foreign currency reserves are held, it's not really switched, I don't think, over the last 20 years, if I remember the data. So, yes, there'll be pockets here and there, things swing year to year, but my sense is that it's not moved in a significant way.
Raad, did you have anything to add?
No, it's just, I think the notion that it really matters for the dollar as a reserve currency, what the oil markets do, sort of overplays how much trade in oil amounts to for sort of international trade more generally, and international trade is still dominated by the dollar. I think that there are a couple of things that, if you were looking over a 20-year period, maybe would change things. One is demand patterns. So at this moment in time, if you see more demand growth and more relative demand in Asia, and particularly sort of, China's always the one that's looked at. The flip side to that is, the prospects of demand growth in China, not sort of plateauing of demand, but demand growth in China for oil over the long term is, the outlook is probably bearish. The Chinese may hit peak oil demand faster than any other major economy. So that's one thing. The other thing that will play into it will be sanctions. If the US, that has always been the issue that has upset people. It's less the sort of the dollar is there as a reserve currency. It is the fact that it can be weaponized. And I think that, if you saw far greater tension between the United States and China over time, if that extended to other sort of oil demand centers over time, then maybe you could see some sort of a shift, again, just to avoid the weaponization of the dollar. But there's nothing significant right now. Watch the Chinese. But as I say, the Chinese lose leverage every time their oil demand growth number goes down.
Yeah, just to wrap that up, it was interesting to see the language coming out of BRICS summits and gatherings, especially as the group started to bring in a number of Middle East and North African countries, including Gulf countries, Iran, UAE, and trying to get others. The Saudis are still sitting on the fence. I found it really curious that some of these allies and partners of the U.S. were attending these summits where, at least for a short period of time, the kind of main talking point was kind of how do we move away from a international financial system dominated by the dollar. But so from time to time, we've seen these questions come up, like to what degree are Gulf states actually going to kind of support that process here or there? And I think, as to echo what the panelists said, haven't seen a lot of that yet. I mean, sovereign wealth funds still heavy exposure to the U.S., to U.S. assets. Currency pegs are another important one. From time to time, people talk about moving away from those currency pegs or the dollar, peg to the dollar. Haven't seen movement on that. Oil sales, barring a couple of small examples of maybe settling some small sales, hasn't really happened. I think where you've seen a little bit more activity is in the less significant and consequential realms like currency swaps. Which, so there's some activity there. So I think we're still waiting for a serious indicator that Gulf states, that government officials are taking steps that would actually move the needle on that front. Any other questions? Okay, I have. Oh, please.
I've got one for Tim. Tim, you talked about Saudi Arabia.
Can we,
Okay.
the microphone there. There we go.
Sorry about that. I wanted to ask Tim, you talked about the Saudi PIF and the budget being quite overdone these days. Couldn't they do another Saudi Aramco IPO round and raise a whole lot of money?
I mean, they could, right. I guess the question is, what would be the demand for that, and ultimately, where would the money come from? So, I think if you look at the, amount of Saudi equity that's held by Aramco equity that's held by international investors, it's maybe like a third of the 2.4%, right? So more is coming from domestic investors. That might help in terms of the, sort of giving them more funds for investing domestically. Less clear it's going to really help in terms of foreign investments. So I think, yes, they could do it. But I think, as somebody was saying also this morning, Saudi equity markets down quite heavily, oil's down. It's not easy, probably. If we're at $65 a barrel oil or lower, it's going to be a less attractive investment than it was during previous IPOs. So I think, yes, in theory, but I think, at the moment, it's probably something that is, I would say, not top of the mind.
Great. If there aren't any other questions, I've got one more question that I'm going to pose to all of the panelists here, because each of you have a slightly different perspective. I mean, Rachel, international and political economy and trade; Raad, energy; Tim, kind of strong macroeconomic and Saudi focus. There's interesting diversity here of perspectives. And I want to get your views about China. So I teach a class about China-Middle East relations, and we always say in the class that the U.S. looms large in China-Middle East relations. So I think for the purposes of this conversation, China looms large in U.S. Middle East relations. So, I mean, from your particular vantage points, and to wrap up this conversation, how do you see China's role in shaping relations between the U.S. and the Gulf, in the years ahead? And of course, there's a strong energy dimension to this, but you don't necessarily have to go in the energy direction. Who'd like to kick things off?
All right. Apparently, I've been volunteered. Look, I think from an energy perspective, China, I mean, despite what I said about the potential for hitting peak demand, China is a massive energy importer, and it is one where Gulf states, particularly the Saudis, have already made strategic investments in capturing long-term demand, as we look out over decades rather than years. And the thing to remember in terms of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, to a lesser extent Kuwait, is it doesn't matter if the IEA's doomsday scenario, or sort of good scenario, depending on how you want to look at it, whether you're a producer or a consumer. It doesn't really matter if oil demand falls to 30 million barrels a day, 25 million barrels a day by 2050, as long as you are capturing as much of that market share as possible. And I think what the Saudis are looking at, and to a lesser extent the UAE, but where they'll get to, is this point of capturing that demand and making sure that the last barrels sold are their barrels, and betting on sort of the nature of the market to ensure that prices don't crash. And if you're looking at it from that perspective, then China is going to be vitally important. So you've made the bets there. You believe that the long-term demand is there. You certainly think that the long-term demand, even if it isn't for transport fuel, will go into petrochemicals, etc. So there is a strategic alignment which gives China influence. So from an energy perspective, I think that's important. And the Chinese are willing to invest in the Gulf. The Chinese have been willing to, they have a different investment model. They have a different investment approach. It's one that potentially makes them more attractive, at least when you look at top-line terms, maybe not if you look at the full value chain. But it's one, and they don't necessarily come with some of the baggage that other investors bring with them. So I think, from an energy perspective, that relationship is going to be enduring, and it's one that the Gulf states have already made, sizable investments in, and therefore will look to perpetuate those investments moving forward.
Who wants to go next, Tim or Rachel? Well, Tim, why don't you go ahead, and we'll let Rachel bring us home here.
Very quickly. So, I think outside of the energy sphere, right, obvious areas, China's heavily involved in construction in Saudi already. That will continue with the Vision 2030. A lot of effort's been going into attracting Chinese tourists to Saudi Arabia. So that's another area. Alternate energy is already, happening, I think, with Chinese companies in Saudi. So I think there are many areas where, China will, increase involvement. So I mean, I think again, this is from the Saudi perspective, it's the more the merrier, right? They want the US investment, they want Chinese investment. They'll have to sort of work the line between those in some areas, but they are very much open for business with people who can bring value to Vision 2030.
Yeah, second all of that. I guess I think, to add something more in this space, I guess to say that, of course, China, both as major supplier, the last panel, and to some extent, I think, highlighted this element, is commitment to renewable energy technology. China as major producer of all of those technologies, so I think they're important both as a supplier of components, but also as a buyer. China, unlike some other countries, has really tried to maintain a diversified portfolio of where they're getting their oil from. Including even in the sort of, from countries in the region, right, trying to avoid some of the challenges that maybe Germany ended up in, and maybe India has gotten itself into, though, vis-a-vis Russia. I'm also conscious of the fact we now live in a world where shadow fleets and shadow transactions are more part of how energy gets to market, and that has implications for, Maya's question earlier on currencies, even if there hasn't maybe been a big shift yet. But this sort of subterfuge kind of, piece, and China's indirect or other sort of involvement, I think is going to be something with us. I'm sort of interested in that broader currency and other trade side and energy side, thinking about where India goes in terms of its supplies. I mean, right now, natural gas is too expensive to displace coal in a place like India. But from a Gulf perspective, I think there's that question mark of what elements of U.S. policy open up or close down certain, bilateral trade relations as sort of things to watch.
Great. Thank you very much. I think that brings us just about to the end of our time. Rachel, Raad, and Tim, thank you so much for joining us on this panel, and I'll turn it over to Ambassador Silliman.
Well, this brings to close AGSI's 11th annual Petro Diplomacy Conference. It has been a pleasure to have all of you here. Again, I want to give special thanks to Genel Energy and to Gulf Sands for helping to make this conference a reality. I want to give special thanks to Paul Weir for bringing a little bit of soil and some good Scottish quotes, and an entirely different pragmatic approach to the question of energy, where we were not talking about macro financial issues or geopolitics, but the way that things get done on the ground. And that's one of the things that I think often gets lost in conferences like this, as you're talking about billions and trillions of dollars of investment. How do you actually get the hydrocarbons out of the ground? How do you actually get the nuclear plants built? How do you actually make sure that the energy gets to the people who need to use it? And a special thanks to everybody who braved today's heat in Washington to come in person here to the Army Navy Club, and to all of those of you who have watched at home. We really appreciate you coming to us to learn a little bit more about the Gulf. We style ourselves as the first place to go when you want to learn about the Gulf. It's what we cover extensively, we cover it deeply, and we do not only geopolitics and energy, we do societal changes, we do sports and arts and culture. So we are the one place, certainly in Washington, where you can come and get a complete picture. This entire conference should be available soon on our website, agsi.org. And until next year for the Petro Diplomacy Conference, thank you all for being here, and have a good and hopefully not too terribly hot afternoon.